services committees. Let me start with North Korea. We've heard from the president over the last couple of days about where things are, where things stand. What is your sense of that now as we move ahead to this meeting? Not on the calendar yet. What do you want to see in place before that happens?
Sure. Well, listen, I think you can interpret some things that North Korea has said as a positive development, but I think we have to be very, very skeptical. To the extent that Kim Jong-un has conceded anything, it's entirely reversible concessions. And the serious question remains as to whether North Korea is serious about dismantling its program. And I think the last 25 years of history suggests that they aren't. And so we have to approach this very skeptically. But at the same time, it makes sense for the president and his team to give them an opportunity diplomatically to prove our skepticism wrong. So again, just have to treat it skeptically, can't agree to any concessions or easing of pressure. We'll see. I mean, the benefit of this is that we'll see if the North Koreans are serious very quickly, and it should be a short conversation.
And as we're talking, we see President Trump making his way to his airplane. He's going back to D.C. This afternoon. Let me ask you about how clear the administration is on what it intends to do. There was word that Mike Pompeo, the CIA director, made this secret trip to Pyongyang, I guess to work out logistics for what that meeting might entail. Do you feel like you're learning enough, you're getting enough information from the administration about what it wants to see happen?
I'll tell you, I was surprised they were actually able to keep that visit secret. In a town like Washington, D.C., where absolutely nothing is secret anymore. But you would want it to unfold secretly, and particularly with a country like North Korea where we don't have traditional diplomatic relations. I think it makes enormous sense for us to reach out through intelligence channels. It also makes some sense for someone like Mike Pompeo to lay the groundwork for a more important presidential summit to come, and also to gauge and ascertain Kim's intention, which, as I mentioned before, are very much suspect right now. And so, listen, we'll see. I do think the administration, we should be in the business of supporting any diplomatic pathway to resolve this crisis. In order for diplomacy to succeed, it needs to be backed by the credible threat of military force. And then when and if they are able to get a deal that I believe needs to involve complete dismantlement of the program. And when they say denuclearization, they're talking about different things than we expect when we say denuclearization. We're really talking about dismantlement of the program. Then at that point, it's appropriate for the administration to open up the details and allow Congress to review it in a way that the previous administration, I don't think, was completely forthcoming when it came to the Iran nuclear negotiations.
I want to ask you about Mike Pompeo. As I mentioned, that vote scheduled to take place tomorrow. You look at what members of the Senate committee have said about how they intend to vote. I think it's 11 members who are not going to vote in favor of his nomination. Bob Menendez, one of them, the senator from New Jersey, is going to join me in the next hour. We'll talk a little bit more about that. What will that say to you if the full Senate doesn't get the recommendation of that Foreign Relations Committee? How much does that damage Mike Pompeo, should he be confirmed by the full Senate as he goes into that job?
Well, I think it's damaging on two levels. The first, it's damaging to the institution of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the Senate. I worked on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for 2 years, and the Republican staff, we confirmed hundreds of Obama administration nominees. The test is always whether this person is individually qualified. It's not a proxy vote on the president's policies, which you may or may not agree with. Clinton and Kerry were both confirmed with 94 votes, and I guarantee you the Republicans that voted for them weren't saying they endorsed all of their policy positions. So I do think it's dangerous. It erodes another norm in the Senate, and there will be retaliation later. Where does that lead us? It's also damaging, I think, to our diplomacy, right? Right now, I think we as Americans should put aside partisan politics and unite behind our country here. Unite behind a diplomatic effort to stave off this crisis before it devolves any further. I think we should want to give Mike Pompeo and the president's team all the tools they need to be successful. And that most basic one is allowing him to be confirmed as Secretary of State. So I really hope Senate Democrats won't go down this route, because I do think it starts a very bad precedent.
I want to ask you about something that's been reported here over these last couple of days. I'll read from New York Magazine here. Secretary of State in waiting Mike Pompeo never served in the Gulf War, even though media outlets and many of his colleagues have repeatedly said he did, and Pompeo has done nothing to dispute their claims. This has come out in news reports. The allegation here is that he hasn't corrected it, that if it's incorrect, he was in the Army, but he wasn't in battle. He should have corrected that. Would love for you to respond to that. I'm also just curious what you think qualifies him to be the chief diplomat. When you look at his career in the Army, congressman, head of the CIA, he doesn't have diplomatic experience. Unlike John Kerry, he wasn't on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee as chairman. What makes him qualified for the job as you see him?
Well, on the first point, I haven't seen the report, so I hesitate to make a judgment. My understanding, though, is that Mike Pompeo himself has never claimed to have combat experience in the Gulf War. And so I'm sure he has 1,000 things that are said about him every day. He doesn't have the time to ascertain which is true and which isn't. So unless he's out there making the claim that he served somewhere he didn't, then I don't think it should be a problem. And I would also note, as someone who's served in the military, you rarely get to choose where you are going. You certainly don't get to choose what sort of conflicts the country's going to be involved in at the time that you join. And then beyond that, you don't get to choose, I'm going here, going there. You go where you're told. And I think he has a distinguished record that qualifies him for service. To get to your second question, he was top in his class at West Point, editor of Harvard Law Review. He has business experience. He has congressional experience. And while he didn't serve on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, at least in the House, he served on foreign relations-related committees. He was a member of the Intelligence Committee. And more to the point, at a time of numerous foreign policy challenges, for the last year he's been operating at a very high level as head of the CIA. By the way, he was confirmed as CIA director with an overwhelming, I believe, 66 to 32 vote. So there were 12 Democrats that supported them. What has changed in the interim? If they thought he was qualified to serve as director of the CIA, suddenly now they don't think he's qualified to serve as Secretary of State. I would submit to you that the only thing that has changed is politics, right? I don't know if it's that we're closer to the midterm or that every senator believes that they need to be president one day. It's just politics at the end of the day. I wish I saw an alternative explanation, but again, I just think it does damage to the institution of the Senate and damage to our diplomacy. And all Americans should want our diplomacy to succeed.
Very quickly here, you mentioned if you're in the military, you don't get to pick where you go. You were in the military, as you said, and
Sure.
you served on the Iraq-Syria border. I want to get your perspective on what this administration's Syria policy is. We look at this International Chemical Weapons Investigatory Group, finally getting access to where this chemical attack occurred. Of course, there were the strikes now just about a week ago. Are you confident that there is a good plan in place for what happens when it comes to U.S. involvement in Syria?
I think we certainly have a plan to decimate and destroy ISIS, which has been largely successful on the ground. What we don't have is a plan for countering Hezbollah's growing influence in Syria, which is Iran's growing influence in Syria, as well as Russia's growing influence in Syria. And I think we should be in the business of deterring future advances by Hezbollah. And the rise of the Russian-Iranian axis has been the biggest development in the region in the last few years. The administration will say that its stated goal is to roll back Iran's influence throughout the Middle East, but in Syria they'll simultaneously say that we stop short of actually actively pushing back against Iranian proxies. That's a contradiction that needs to be resolved at some point, and it also involves the ambivalence over our position on the Iran nuclear deal, right? Because the nuclear program and the sanctions windfall that they got from the deal are just two of many ways that Iran expresses its power throughout the region. So I think we do need a little bit of clarity there. I do think striking, though, in Syria was absolutely the right course of action, but hopefully it will be the prelude to a more comprehensive strategy to roll back Iran's influence throughout the Middle East.
And the deadline for that nuclear deal coming up next month. Congressman Gallagher, thank you very much. Nice to see you here in New York. That's Mike Gallagher of Wisconsin. And still ahead, my one-on-one